Hello and welcome back to Anthropology 105. Today we are talking about parental investment. Most people don't think about all of the choices that parents have to make until they become parents themselves. And if you are a parent, you know that time and resources are very limited. So we can think about resources in terms of food or water. In this case, this is a picture of the Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest. And the different colors represent the levels of water increase or decrease in the aquifer. An aquifer is a huge underground lake. Now, a lot of people in this area tap into this aquifer to acquire water to water their farms. So you can see overall that the aquifer is in the red. That means that there's more water leaving the aquifer than entering it. So this water is limited in terms of what people can use it for. So resources, kind of in general for the population, but more specifically how much food you have in the house to feed your kids, that kind of thing. These are limited. They're not infinite. Same thing goes for space. So this is a satellite picture of agricultural fields, and you can see that they're all right one on top of one another. There's limited land on the planet for people to farm, essentially, and to raise their kids. And some places space is more limited than others, but again, space is finite on our planet. Also time. We think about our lifespan, and even if you start very early, let's say you started having children at the age of 13, you still only have so many years to live, which limits the number of offspring that you can have. What this means is that parents are strategic, and historically parents have had to be strategic. Parents who did a good job managing limited time, space, and resources had more and more surviving offspring, and you can guess that they left ancestors who have inherited those behavioral predispositions today. So parents who have behaviors that maximize their reproductive success, the number of kids and grandkids that they have, by allocating limited time and limited resources to their offspring. These are the parents who will be more successful and leave ancestors descendants such as ourselves. And if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, we understand that natural selection favors behavior and physiology that maximize total lifetime survival and reproduction. So the word total is underlined here because parents sometimes have to play the long game. They have to think not only in the immediate present, but also in the future. If I'm investing in this particular baby, what does it mean for future children that I have? What does it mean for my future grandchildren if I have another offspring? So parents not only have to be strategic in the present moment, but they have to be strategic over the course of their lifespans about how they're going to distribute these limited time and resources that they have access to. And this set of decisions is called life history theory. Life history studies how organisms, including humans, allocate or distribute these limited resources. And I'm going to walk you through this chart. It's called a decision tree. And you can think of this chart as like a bank account. You have an investment. You have so many time and resources in your lifespan. How do you want to invest that time or those resources? And there are lots of choices to be made. One choice that a lot of you are making right now is you can invest your limited time and resources into somatic effort. This is into your own body, your own soma. Or you can invest your time and resources into reproductive effort. So you have a choice. Say you're thinking about going out on a Friday night and finding a mate with the goal of reproducing. You can stay home, you can study, you can get over your cold, you can maybe, if you're still growing, you can put that energy that you would have spent on the dance floor into increased growth. Or you can go out and try to reproduce. Now, if your total lifetime reproductive success might depend on how you make these decisions. If you are very, very sick, going out might kill you. If you die, you're not going to be able to reproduce. So if you're very, very sick, you might prefer to stay home and invest in your somatic effort. You might choose to repair your body so that in the future you can invest in reproductive effort. If your growth spurt is done, if you're healthy, if you're in good condition, maybe you prefer to go out and try to spend your limited resources on reproduction, your limited time on reproduction. Now, one of the kickers is here that if you invest in somatic effort, that can be fed back into reproductive effort. So let's think of this from the perspective of a teenager. Let's think of this from the perspective of this guy, little Maisie's father. So he's 13. He can invest in somatic or reproductive effort. His reproductive effort might be increased if he spends more time growing, more time learning, more time investing in himself than beginning reproduction so early. If he is able to get more of an education, make more money, he might be able to support more offspring in the long run. So somatic effort can feed back into reproductive effort as well, just like with the example of, say you want to go out and you're really, really sick. Well, you might be best off staying home, getting better, so that you can invest in reproductive effort in the future. So these are complicated decisions. Don't be afraid if you want to stop the slide and rewind and watch it again, because there's another choice coming up. So you have time and resources in your bank account. You can invest it in improving yourself, your body, your resources. You can invest it in reproductive effort. Once you've made the decision to choose reproductive effort, you can have two options here. You can invest in parenting, or you can invest in mating. So you say, I'm going to go out, I'm going to get me some offspring tonight. Are you going to go out and maybe work your job and buy food for your children? Or are you going to go out and work your job and buy a present for your boyfriend or your girlfriend to influence them in their reproductive decisions? There are choices here as well. Do you have current offspring? What is the offspring quality? Do they need your help? Is the other parent doing a great job taking care of them? What are the mating options? Are there mates available for you? All of these things are included because we would like to think about the ecology, the local ecology affecting these decisions. Are there mates? This is part of the ecology. That will affect whether you choose mating versus parenting. So let's go through some of these one by one, and we'll talk about some of the trade-offs here. And as I said, just a reminder, this is called life history theory, and all of these decisions involve trade-offs. In an ideal world, you would invest unlimited resources in mating and parenting and in oneself. But because your resources and your time are limited, there's going to be trade-offs in choosing one option or the other. And these decisions about allocating time and resources may vary between the sexes, between males and females, and they may vary over an individual's lifetime. And one of the last trade-offs that we'll talk about is called current versus future. Should you reproduce now or should you reproduce later? So let's think about this first decision. Should you invest in yourself or should you invest in reproduction? And this graph shows you what we mean by trade-offs. So I've eliminated the arrows here because you're going to have to start being able to read these graphs without my help. As reproductive activity increases, and this is seconds per day, so you can see this on the x-axis going from 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 seconds a day, we can compare this to the growth rate of these blue-headed wrasses, and these are the males, so they're just a little fish. As the blue-headed wrasses increase the amount of energy they're putting into their reproductive effort, you can see that the growth rate declines. So the more energy male blue-headed wrasses spend on reproduction, the less energy they have to spend on growing. So the males who spend more energy on reproduction will be smaller in the long run. Let's look at some data on female red deer. So here we go. We have age in years of the deer. And here we have two categories of deer. We have deer who are nursing, who have a young fawn, and we have deer who are not nursing. And we can compare the age and nursing or not nursing to mortality rate. First thing that we see is in both cases, as the deer get older, the mortality rate increases. But we also see that because the nursing line is above the non-nursing line, at all ages, female red deer who are nursing have a higher mortality rate, which means that they're more likely to die. So there's a definite trade-off here when you invest in yourself versus investing in reproduction. Both survival and reproductive success are important in terms of natural selection, but you can't do both always. In this case, choosing to have a baby increases the likelihood of you dying, and if you're dead, you can't have any more babies. But if you don't have any babies, then your genes aren't getting passed on anyway, so it's a trade-off. And we expect that animals have inherited decision-making mechanisms about how to manage these trade-offs over the lifespan. So let's look at mating versus parenting effort now. This is a Hadza man. He is a forager, a hunter-gatherer living in East Africa. And the trade-off that this man is making is, should he pursue more mates or should he invest in his child? So we've got here on the graph women per man in camp. So on the very far right, we've got 1.6 women per man. So basically 3 women for every 2 men. And on the left-hand side, we've got 0.4 women per man. So about 2 men to every 1 woman. So on the right, more women than men. On the left, more men than women. And you can look at the amount of parenting that's going on here, the index of investment or nurturing. As the women per man increase, there is less parenting investment. So as there are more mates available for men, they're bothering less with investing in their current offspring, and they're pursuing more mates. They're trying to increase the number of offspring that they have by pursuing more mates. So it's a trade-off, and again, you can see it depends on local ecologies. How many potential mates are available in your campsite, and that will help determine how you decide whether to invest in mating or invest in parenting. So now let's talk about how some of these decisions might play out over the course of the life cycle. And one of the most interesting trade-offs I think there is to think about is this trade-off of current versus future. How much should you invest in your current reproduction? How much should you invest in yourself in order to get reproduction in the future? If you invest a lot in current reproduction, it hinders growth, as we saw in the blue-headed wrasses. It hinders survivalship, as we saw in the female red deer, and it could possibly hinder future reproduction. If you exhaust yourself to the point of death or illness or injury, you might not be able to reproduce in the future. And of course, this varies across the life cycle. How much future do you have left? As you age, as you reach the average age of death in your population, you're seeing less and less future ahead of you. So you're going to be making decisions more and more in the present. And we see this shift towards investment in your current reproduction with age. So this picture is an example of prairie dogs. Prairie dogs in general are good moms. 91% of prairie dogs invest in their infants. However, 9% of prairie dog moms will either abort their babies or eat the fetuses shortly after birth. These moms weigh less. They're usually sick. They're usually going into the breeding season and the following winter in a very poor condition. The choice for them is have this litter, try to raise them, and probably die, probably not make it through the winter, or abandon the sunk cost, accept the fact that this isn't a good year for you, abandon your investment, and try again next year. If you think next year is going to be a good year, that sounds like a good plan. If this is your last breeding season, those prairie dog moms might prefer to see the pups to adulthood. So you can see this decision of whether you should reproduce depends on how much future is ahead of you and what the current condition looks like. And you bet your butts that this happens in humans as well. So this is some data from Daly and Wilson's book Homicide. It comes from crime rates in Canada in the 1970s and 80s, and it's about infanticide. And we can look at infanticides occurring in Canada. These are infanticides per million births, so pretty low in general, but it still happens quite frequently. And mother's age. As we can see, with increasing mother's age, women are much less likely to commit infanticide. The most infanticides occur around age 19 years old or less. As there's less and less future ahead of these women as they age, they're more likely to invest in current reproduction. The youngest women with the greatest future ahead of them, the longest future ahead of them, are the ones who are deciding to forego their current reproductive activities. The little blip at the end, over 35 years, that's only 3 women, so we can't really be sure whether that's increasing or not because there's so few women at that age who commit infanticide. So we see that younger women exhibit the highest rates of infanticide, and it's the younger women who have additional chances to reproduce. Now we can also look at marital status, because we'll see that unwed mothers are more prone to infanticide even after controlling for age. So here we go. Here's married versus unmarried women, and the women who are unmarried are more likely to commit infanticide. There are higher rates of infanticide for unmarried women. One of the clues that these women might be using that the current is not a good time to reproduce is the lack of support from other individuals in their environment. And we've been reading a lot in Sarah Hurdy's book about how key support is to mothers, especially young mothers, to successfully raising children. And we can see these patterns cross-culturally as well. It's not just in Canada. Infanticide is fairly common around the world and fairly common historically. Infanticide is more likely when the child is unlikely to survive, so infanticide is more likely to happen when the child has cues that it might not make it to adulthood, like deformities or specific illnesses. Infanticide is more likely when parents lack resources to invest in the child, like those unmarried women on the previous slide. And it's more likely when the child's father is not the mother's husband. The mother's husband might not be so keen to invest in a child that he knows is not his, and she might get more support for future offspring if she forgoes the current reproductive endeavor. So I've put up pictures of the Concorde jet because the Concorde fallacy is if you've already invested in something like a Concorde jet, even though it's financially never going to pay off, you should just keep investing in it because you've already invested in it. Now, this is not the case for reproduction. If you've invested in the pregnancy when the child's born, if it looks like it's unlikely to survive in many societies and historically around the world, humans choose to commit infanticide because you don't want to keep paying that cost over and over and never reaping the rewards. Now, remember, these are behavioral predispositions, and we're going to be discussing parenting behavior at the end of the lecture from 4 different perspectives. So people are not locked into infanticide as a way to manipulate their reproductive decisions. So let's talk about quantity versus quality. This is one other trade-off that humans and other organisms are making. The more offspring you have, the less you can invest in each one of those offspring because your time and resources are limited. So I love this chart here between R and K. These are two reproductive strategies across the animal kingdom. You can see the giant clam on the left. The giant clam makes 500 million eggs a year. Each egg is about the size of a grain of sand, and there's very, very little parental investment outside the creation of the egg. Now, if you think about the other end of the spectrum, apes, so there's one gorilla born to his or her mother every 5 years. So there's an incredible amount of time and resources invested in a gorilla baby. Now, of course, the gorilla is a lot bigger and a lot more capable of varied behaviors than a clam is. So the investment pays off, but it comes at a cost because you're only producing one offspring every 5 years, as opposed to 500 million every single year. So we call these opposite ends of the spectrum R strategists and K strategists. The offspring of R strategists tend to be smaller and weaker and more vulnerable, like clam eggs. The offspring of K strategists tend to be larger and stronger and more protected, like gorilla babies. R strategists tend to mature and reproduce rapidly, so they become adults quickly, reproduce a lot and generally have short lifespans. K strategists tend to mature and reproduce slowly, and they tend to have much longer lifespans. And one thing that can make a key difference here is the stability of the environment. R strategists tend to inhabit unstable environments, so they don't know what's going to happen. It's kind of the shotgun approach to reproduction. K strategists tend to inhabit more stable environments, so parents feel comfortable investing because they feel comfortable that their investment will make a difference in the child's own survival and reproductive success. So one decision that parents are making in their lifespan is not only when to have children or if to have children, but how many children to have. And this is partly dependent on the stability of the environment and the amount of resources that are available to invest in the child. So one thing to consider when investing in offspring is, are the resources divisible? Can you share the food around between your offspring? Do you have enough space to keep them all? How many resources per child are needed to make them reproductively successful? In highly competitive environments, you might have to invest more in each child, which is going to limit the number of children that you can have. And if you look at patterns of inheritance, we tend to see patterns of primogeniture, having only the oldest child inherit, essentially, when resources are not divisible and where it's very competitive to get a high-quality mate. In other cases, when resources can't be allocated in large amounts, you might be more willing to invest in each child equally because they're all going to be equally competitive. And you might be willing to have more children overall because you don't have to invest so much in each one. And this varies by society, and it varies by mode of subsistence. Are you a pastoralist? Do you herd animals for a living? Are you an agriculturalist? Do you farm for a living? Are you a hunter-gatherer? Do you forage for a living? So these decisions are very much based on the local ecology and local environment as well. And one big question that generally comes up about parental investment is dads. How much should dads invest in their children? How much paternal care should be invested? And these are my kind of 4 qualifications for paternal care. If the cost of assistance is low, then why not? As long as the cost is not high, it's much easier for dads to invest in their kids. Invest meaning babysit, feed, teach, clean, look after. If these are all low, if children can easily be cared for and looked after, then why not invest, essentially? Is it necessary? Can mom make it on her own? If paternal care is necessary, then we're going to see more of it. If paternal care is not necessary to the survival of and reproductive success of the child, then we see it less often. Can paternal care make a difference? Can dad affect the prospects of the offspring? In areas of the world where infant mortality rates are high because of infectious diseases in the environment that people have no control over, fathers might be less willing to invest in offspring because it's much less likely that you have any control over the outcome. And finally, paternity certainty. Every mother knows who her baby is. She's carried it for 9 months and she's experienced birth. Fathers are much less certain whether they're the father or not because conception takes place so far in advance of the birth. So the more certain a father is that the child is his, the more likely he is to invest in it. If he is very certain that the child is not his, he's a lot less likely to invest in the child. Now, again, thinking about this from multiple perspectives, that's not saying that men don't invest in children who aren't their own. That's definitely 100% not the case. But this plays a role in the amount of investment that we see. And when you look over many societies over a lot of historical time, you can see very clearly that higher paternity certainty is equivalent to higher investment. So we're almost there to the 4-level slide. First, we have to think about what it means to be a parent and how people learn to be parents. So all of these trade-offs and paying attention to the local ecologies and responses to the local ecologies, these are what I call predispositions. So you have behavioral predispositions that made your ancestors successful. But one thing that we see for sure is that there are no fixed patterns of parenting in humans. From primates, we are primates. We have a large neocortex. We have very flexible behavior based on our ecological context. We know that primate parents do have to learn. First-time mothers are notoriously bad parents, and being the firstborn offspring to a baboon or a chimpanzee is pretty bad luck because you're unlikely to survive because your mom doesn't know what she's doing. We also have a lot of hormonal priming for childcare. So these hormones that are circulating during pregnancy, like estrogen and progesterone, that can time and control the pregnancy, oxytocin that's released during lactation that increases bonding between the mother and the infant. We have hormonal priming for childcare, but there's a lot of learning that is required for us to successfully raise infants. So I just wanted to go through one quick example before our final slide here. Let's talk about life history decisions that pastoralists are making, hopefully to put some of these things in a little more context for you. So pastoralists are people who make a living by raising livestock, herds of livestock, usually moving them from place to place. So one thing about pastoral livestock is that compared to, say, nuts in the forest, it's very much a clumped resource. You can gather all of the animals in one place. And not only are these clumped, but they're divisible. So males are able to gather a lot of resources if their herds do well. And these large clumped resources allow them to attract multiple wives in some cases if they're big enough. So for pastoralists, we often see the marriage system of polygyny. Multiple women married to one man because he's able to provide enough resources to support the reproductive efforts of multiple wives. Males need resources to get married, though, and because in a lot of pastoralist communities there are very regulated roles of women, fathers often have high paternity certainty because there's a lot of guarding of wives. And most families tend towards patrilineal inheritance because fathers know who their sons are, and more crucially, sons know who their sons are, so they feel secure passing inherited resources down through the male line. And sons are more likely to defend the herds because these clumped resources are a target for other competitors. And as I said, these resources are divisible, but it may not be ideal to divide the herds too much because then you'll lose your social standing. So we do see a preference towards inheritance by elder sons. And of course, not everybody in the society is wealthy. So males who are not wealthy may end up either unmarried, or some brothers will scrape together a bride wealth payment and end up sharing a wife. And this is a marriage system of polyandry. Sorry, that should say polyandry. Or in some cases, families may end up investing in their daughters instead of their sons, and hoping that by investing in their daughters, they can marry. They can marry up and be one of these polygynous wives. So that's one thing we didn't get to talk about in lecture, is investing in daughters versus sons. If you're interested in this trade-off, please contact me and I'd be happy to tell you more about that. So let's just close the lecture by thinking about 4 levels of parenting. We have our proximate level. How are you making your parenting decisions? What are the immediate triggers in your environment that might affect your parenting style, or whether you decide to parent or not? Is it dangerous? Are there predators? Do you have annoying in-laws who are constantly badgering you to have more children? Are you hungry? Are your children hungry? If you have another offspring, will there be enough food to go around to the other kids? Or will there be enough food to keep yourself alive until your next reproductive opportunity? So what are the immediate triggers in your environment? What's going on in the local ecology that could affect the decisions that you're making right now? On to genetic. Remember, this is the developmental process. So what have you learned so far in your life? What do you know about parenting? What have your experiences been? Where are you at in the stage of your development? These can affect whether you decide to maybe invest in self versus invest in reproductive effort, or maybe if you feel like you know nothing about parenting, you prefer to invest in mating effort instead. So where are you at in your life, and what have you learned so far? These will affect your parenting decisions. Phylogenetic. What parenting behaviors have we inherited from our primate ancestors? And we discussed some of these on the previous slides. And finally, ultimate. How do parenting behaviors increase the lifetime reproductive success of parents? How are these, and this is kind of how we went through these levels today, how are they affecting whether parents are maximizing their reproductive success or not? So that's it for parental investment. Like I said, please contact me if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thanks for listening.